With this video, I'm going to show you how I turned this $8 Chinese Jason Voorhees mask into this. Step 1. Reshaping the mask. These masks are a little bit wide for a part 3 hockey mask. So what I did was I preheated my oven to about 300 degrees. Then I placed the mask in the oven for about 3 minutes. Then I took it out wearing gloves and I bent it with my hands, squeezed the two outside edges in towards the center, and then ran it under cold water. As you can see, now the mask has a definite different shape than it originally had. The next step after that, it was time to put on the base coat. Now, knowing that there is a scratch on the nose and a scratch on the forehead, I figured I'd just tape those off with the little piece of masking tape. I just found that it just saves time than trying to scrape it all off, and you might not get the proper shape that you want. I put about 4 coats of the Krylon on. I used Krylon Fusion, one shade lighter than almond. After the base coat had set for 24 hours, I roughed up the base coat with a scouring pad, and then I set forth applying a slightly darker, more almond tone paint that I would wash off later. Now, this is a technique that I saw others use online. It didn't work the greatest for me. In fact, later on a second mask, I found it easier to actually dilute some of the paint, paint it on, and then just wipe it off with a dry cloth. I found that way more effective and a lot less time consuming. But for this particular one, I did use this technique. I roughed up some of the areas that I wanted to be darker with some sandpaper, just so that they would take a little bit more of the color, and I applied a second wash just mostly to those areas. And this time I did use my own technique where I just painted on a thin layer of the paint and just wiped it away. The next part was the hardest part, but also the most satisfying. I had a lot of reference photos for the part 3 mask, barn scene mask, and I opened up one of those and had it right beside the mask, and I took a small piece of 80 grit sandpaper and I just roughed up lightly the areas that I knew had scratches or scrapes. Because I only used 4 coats, I had to be very light on this because I didn't want to go all the way through. Only on certain areas that I wanted to show the actual white of the mask underneath. I also used an X-Acto knife for certain areas. Like I wanted to make sure that there was straight up and down lines on the forehead crack. I'll go into the crackle in the next step. I took a dark paint, and using that same technique, I would just paint it into the areas that I wanted darker, and then I'd wipe it away. And for certain areas, I just went over with a really fine brush and made sure that those areas stayed dark. You can notice it on the scratch on the on-screen right side of the mask, as well as by the eye. I wanted a certain shape by the left side of the screen eye hole. So I delicately, with a pretty fine, I used a watercolor brush to paint that in. For this next part here, I made a mistake. I clear coated it to seal it before I put on what is called one-step crackle effect from Deco Art. I like that one. I've used others, none work as well. This one's just one-step process. You paint it on, let it dry. Now the problem is it works better if it's actually adhering to the acrylic paint you're using, which I didn't do. Putting it on the clear coat, it just didn't crackle the way I wanted it to. Again here, I just used that same technique. I watered down a really dark color and I just washed it over and then wiped it away with a cloth. I used a wet cloth this time as I didn't want any of that color to be on the top layer, but just to sit in those cracks that the crackle effect created. I gave it about 20 minutes to dry before I applied the paint. So we're almost done here. Now I just put on the chevrons. The way I designed these is I had a picture that I took offline, and in Illustrator marked out the shape of the chevrons and then printed it out on fairly thick cardstock. Then I cut those shapes out with an X-Acto knife. Then I placed the shapes on the mask and just drew with a pencil around them, placing them as best I could. And then I just taped off the areas that I didn't want the paint to adhere to it, obviously. I put 2 coats of this fairly bright red paint on the mask. I didn't have painter's tape, and I'm not sure if it was the crackle effect underneath or if it was the painter's tape or the masking tape I was using, but I didn't get a real nice sharp edge. I had to go back in and manually with the brush really go around those edges and fine tune them. And that's pretty much it. I just added a couple coats of satin clear coat from Krylon over top to seal it all in, and that's it. And believe it or not, this is the first Jason Voorhees mask I have ever done, and I just wanted to document the process and help others who are learning to do these as well. Thanks.